migration and where is Europe heading? My name is Karin Zelano. I'm the program director of Forest Migration Program. I am extremely happy to welcome our panel today as well. Before we start, I would like to encourage you all to tweet like madmen and use the hashtag Forest. So, a warm welcome to all of you. I will start with introducing Dr. Heather Grabbe, the director of Open Society European Policy Institute in Brussels and also the director of EU Affairs. Very welcome. Mr. Thomas Hammarberg, former Council of Europe, Commissioner for Human Rights and former Secretary General of Amnesty International, among other things. Next to me, I have Mr. Peter Kellner, the president of YouGov, which is the most quoted research center in the UK and famous for the accuracy of your opinion polls.
Good, I'll pay you later for that.
And last, Mr. Philippe Legrain, the principal advisor of the Bureau of European Policy Advisors in Brussels, and also the author of several books, among them Immigrants, Your Country Needs Them. So very welcome. As the director of Forest Migration Program, I truly feel I have my dream team here today to attack and analyze the topic of migration and integration policy in Europe. So I will start by giving the word to Philippe. I first heard Philippe Legrain in Brussels at a conference organized by Dr. Grabbe, talking about the rising support for xenophobic populist parties in Europe. And I got back to Stockholm, totally starstruck, and started the project to translate Philippe's book, Immigrants, Your Country Needs Them, to Swedish. And I'm extremely proud that we will publish it in Swedish this fall, with an extra chapter by Tove Livendal, and also a new preface by Philippe. So, straight from, and we're extremely happy as well that President Barroso would spare you a few days to let you be here and discuss this with us today. So, Philippe, straight from the heart of Europe in Brussels, where is Europe heading on the area of migration and integration?
Oh, well, thank you very much, Karin, for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. I've been asked to speak for 5 minutes initially, so I'm going to keep my remarks short. Three things: trends, attitudes, and policy. First of all, migration trends. They have changed dramatically since the crisis over the past 5 years. Until 5 years ago, there was huge influxes of immigrants to the booming economies on Europe's periphery, and to more traditional countries of migration, such as Britain. Since the crisis, not only have those trends ended, but actually there have started to be reverse flows. So you're seeing that people actually are no longer, in the decade before the crisis, more than half of the migrants who arrived in Europe went to Spain. And now that has basically ended, and Spanish people themselves are emigrating to Germany, albeit in relatively small numbers. And you've seen more generally that since the crisis has happened, that a lot of that migration, which was driven by the jobs that were available, has slowed down. The second big thing, and also coincides with the crisis, but it also preceded it, is that there has been a hardening of attitudes towards immigration. And you can see that in many respects. And first of all, you can see the public support for immigration has fallen in many countries, not least in my own Britain. You can see across Europe the rise of populist, xenophobic, anti-immigration parties who, even if the reason why people vote for it is not entirely immigration is often a very important factor. Obviously here in Sweden you have the Sweden Democrats, a particularly nasty version, given that they have neo-Nazi roots. But you have equivalents of varying degrees of nastiness. In Britain there's UKIP, in France there's the National Front, in Italy there's the Northern League, in Greece there is Golden Dawn, also neo-Nazi. In Hungary there's Jobbik, there's Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, there's the Danish People's Party in Denmark, and so on. So there's a whole host of these, and they've been growing generally, not universally, but they've been growing in support in recent years. And at the same time, some of their policies, some of their attitudes are starting to infect, or have infected, so-called mainstream parties. And you can see that most obviously, the trend started actually in the Netherlands, where previously there was a strong consensus in favour of migration and diversity, and now you see a broad agreement that if not that it's a bad thing, but at least that it's of a highly questionable one. And you can see more recently the same thing has happened in Britain, whereby since the new coalition government took over in 2010, the Liberal Party, which was the most pro-migration, has basically accepted a very anti-immigration stance taken by the Conservative Party. The Labour Party has interpreted its election defeat as being due to immigration and has become much more anti-immigration. And as I said, the rise of the UK Independence Party means that basically there are no pro-migration parties at all in Britain. How has that affected policy? Well, the good news on this respect is that Sweden is an outlier. Sweden, just in the midst of the crisis, December 2008, just after Lehman Brothers collapsed, brought in the most liberal immigration policy in Europe, if not the world. I mean, it's a model for other countries in terms of it means that employers can hire people of all skill levels from any country in the world on 2-year renewable visas, and that is a very positive step. In other countries, you've seen a much more restrictionist stance being taken. In my own country, Britain, there's an immigration cap, which is leading to absurdities like trying to keep out foreign students, who are huge benefit to the economy, or immoralities, I would call them. Now you have to earn more than average income in order to bring a foreign wife to live with you in the United Kingdom. I mean, you think about it, what right does the government have to tell you who you can marry and who you can live with? It's deeply immoral. It used to be something that only Denmark did. I thought it would never happen in my own country, and there it has. At the same time, there are a few counter trends, like places like Germany, which is more and more aware of the need for high-skilled migration and trying to change its policies. So that's broadly the outlook of where we are, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then I thought we'd continue with you, Thomas, with a strong human rights perspective. So please, floor is yours.
First, I would like to support the statement just heard, that we have a hardening of attitudes in Europe. And this is very, very obvious if you look at the human rights effects of that as well. And that, of course, has influenced the policies. When I traveled around in the European countries, I saw the effects hardening all over. And one important aspect was what I call the signal policy. That governments didn't want to send signals which they felt would invite more people to come. And in Greece, for instance, when they imprisoned so many of those who came to seek protection, one of the arguments for that, when you talk with the politicians, was that if we were more generous, if we did not have a tough policy of imprisoning those people, more people would come. And they hoped that they would take another route into Europe. So that's one aspect. I think there are two major problems now in the policy in Europe after the very positive decision recently in Brussels of a common asylum policy. One is that the access to the possibility of seeking asylum has been reduced over the years. It's very difficult for many who have good grounds to seek protection in Europe. It's very difficult for them actually to have the possibility to deliver their request for asylum here in Europe. We have still a system where boats coming from or North Africa are turned away, and very little concern about the many people who have drowned in the Mediterranean during the last 4 or 5 years. We're talking about thousands of people who have drowned in the Mediterranean. Where is the discussion about this? And what is the responsibility for European decision makers that people are actually dying in their desperate attempt to reach Europe to seek asylum or to seek some kind of protection or at least a better life for themselves? Very little discussion about that. So access, and we still have the policy of asking the airlines to secure that those who enter the flights to Europe have a visa. And visa is not easy to get in some countries for some groups of people, of course. But we are asking airline staff to be the policemen, the border police function in other countries. And that, of course, has the effect that some people who would have very good reasons to seek protection in Europe cannot do that because of this policy. And of course, the borders are very closed. We have a tendency in some countries to criminalize not only the stay in the country without permit, but also the entering into the country without permit. So we have that trend which is there, which prevents people even to seek their right, their human right, their internationally agreed right to seek asylum. And the other major problem, I think, is the lack of some kind of interstate solidarity in Europe when it comes to refugees. Where we have, I mean, it's the last figure I saw from the UNHCR, the High Commissioner of Refugees, was that 90% of the asylum given in Europe or sought in Europe come from 10 countries. So the majority of the EU members take a very small burden or a small contribution to giving protection to people who seek protection in Europe. And in Greece, in Cyprus, in Italy and in Spain, people are very upset about the lack of sort of generosity from some of the northern countries. Sweden may be an exception here, and there may be one or two other exceptions, but by and large there is very little interstate solidarity when it comes to contributing to giving protection in Europe. And that hopefully will be resolved in the continued discussion about the common policy, because the intention there, and Cecilia Malmström has done a good job there, to try to equalize the standards in Europe is a good policy. But our fear is that the agreements now reached on the changes of the directives will be interpreted in different ways in different countries. There will still be an ongoing attempt to send the signals that we are not the best country to come to, go to the other countries instead. And it's very important that there is a follow-up on the agreement now, which will secure that there will be a genuine equality of standards in Europe, so that also the anger which is there in the southern countries could be met with some constructive response.
Thank you. Would you just a quick follow-up question there? Would you say that this kind of mild or non-existing interest or will to discuss the human rights aspect, would you say that that goes for integration policy as well, once immigrants have entered the country?
I think that there is a very clear link between integration policy and the migration policy. And one of the problems I have with the Swedish Democrats is that when they hammer that they don't want any more people to come, one of the victims for that propaganda, or many of the victims, are those who are already in the country, because of course they get the feeling that they shouldn't have come, they were not really welcome from a part of the population.
So of course this is reflected in how countries treat integration policy as well.
And then we have the major problem of people underground who have no permit to stay. We don't know how many there are for obvious reasons, but we talk about millions in Europe who are exploited by landlords, by scrupulous employers. They run the risk of being drawn into prostitution, etc. It's a major social problem which we have not really addressed constructively.
So quite a dark picture when it comes to national policy then. Now I turn to you, Peter Kellner, because you know what people think. So that's what people do. so let's paint a picture of what Europeans and maybe especially Britain thinks.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to talk mainly about Britain. I think quite a lot of what I say can be read across to much of Europe, but some things are obviously specific to the UK. At the moment, when we at YouGov ask people which of the 3 or 4 most important issues facing the country, we give them a list of, I think it's now 13 or 14 subjects, immigration is second. It's, after the economy, it is easily the next biggest concern of people. And when you ask them what they want immigration stopped or drastically cut back. And one of the political consequences of this, as Philippe says, the attitudes have been hardening in recent years, is that we now have in Britain, for the first time, a non-toxic right-wing nationalist party. We've had neo-Nazi parties in the past. We've had Oswald Mosley going back to the 1930s. We had the National Front in the 1970s. We've had the British National Party in recent years. And occasionally they've had sporadic bits of very localised success. But with the UK Independence Party, UKIP, we now have a party which is not tagged with being neo-Nazi and has built up quite a substantial electoral record. It came second in the European Parliament elections in 2009. In the British local elections 2 months ago, it got around 20% of the vote. Its polling, you find its polling support when we ask about a general election is now running around 11, 12, 13%, ahead of the Liberal Democrats, which is the Britain's third party and part of the coalition. UKIP are now ahead of the Liberal Democrats. And in next year's European Parliament elections, the way things are currently looking, they will come first. They will be the top party. There will be more British Euro MPs from UKIP than from any other party, Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrats, Green. That's the problem. Now let me qualify it. The first thing is, well, before I get to the qualifications, one other bit of bad news is that at the moment, one of the top issues of controversy amongst those who raise migration is that in Britain, as I think in some other countries, in a few months' time, the transition arrangements for Bulgaria and Romania will end. And there's a lot of talk about Britain being flooded with people who, under European Union free movement rules, will be coming from Romania and Bulgaria. It's not going to happen, but people might think it's happening. So the immigration debate is now getting wrapped up with the debate about Britain's involvement in the European Union. It's one of the issues which makes the European Union not very popular in Britain. People like free movement in that they can work or retire elsewhere in Europe, but they're not keen on people from other countries having the same right to come to Britain. Now for the qualifications. It's the second topic chosen by more than half the population when they're asked which are the most important issues facing Britain. But when we show people the same list and say which are the most important issues facing you and your family, it comes way down. It's around below 20%, anything immigration. So there's a difference between issues facing the country, issues facing you and your family. Also, when you ask people what they think is now going on, most people think immigration is bad for Britain's economy, when all the objective studies show that it's good for the economy. And people think immigration is rising when the latest figures show that last year, 2012, net immigration was down 1/3 in 2011. And when you analyse people's attitude to immigration by knowledge about immigration, there's a clear correlation. Those people who think that immigration is falling and that it's good economic news, they're pro-immigration. So a lot of the attitudes to immigration are driven by a sense of what's going on, which is simply at odds with all independent evidence. But I would go deeper than that, because what I think is going on, and I'd be interested to know whether this is common in other parts of Europe, is that really immigration is, for most people who are concerned about it, a symptom of a deeper thing, that Britain is not what it was. That kids have a tougher time getting a job or buying a house or a flat. People who had secure jobs now have insecure jobs. There's a nostalgia for an imagined past, which is probably not the real past, but we're dealing with nostalgia and complaints about what Britain now is. And at the same time, this is probably more specific to Britain, politicians as a breed are more distrusted now than they have ever been. You'll be aware of the arguments about MPs' expenses and things like that. So that politicians, when they try and tell the truth about immigration, are not believed because they're not believed about anything. So what's the solution? If we're to have a more civilised debate in Britain about immigration, then in my view, you've got to go much further back, or we might need a much more civilised discourse in our newspapers and amongst our politicians about politics and social conditions more generally, because as long as people think that social conditions are bad and politicians are liars, I think that any policy on immigration by those politicians is going to be distrusted. So it is down to economic progress, social stability and political trust. I think those are the core issues that really drive the problem.
Thank you very much. Now, Heather Grabbe, I know almost as you planned it, as we've planned it, this is an excellent comment for you to follow up on. I know, amongst other things, that the Open Society Institute, you're involved in several projects touching upon this aspect of the anti-immigration support, the nostalgia and the kind of mistrust in politicians. So please, the floor is yours.
Yes, well, it's a pleasure to be here and also to hear this very interesting debate. I think it would be impossible to have a debate where the speakers agreed with each other as much as we've done this morning. In London, Paris, Rome, Athens, possibly even in Berlin. So I think I'll be very interested to hear what the audience think about this, because the Swedish debate, as Philippe started at the beginning, now looks more and more like an outlier. Sweden was kind of in the centre of views on migration policy in the 1990s, and now Sweden has moved to an extreme liberal position without having changed very much. It's just everybody else seems to have moved. So I'm curious to know what you make of this debate, particularly with three Brits on the panel. At the Open Society European Policy Institute in Brussels, we've been looking quite deeply into the politics of populism, and why is it that populist parties are doing so well. And there seem to be some, in quite a large number of countries, for many different reasons. One of the kind of standard explanations people give is, well, it's cyclical. When you have an economic crisis, people feel insecure, they're worried about the future, they tend to go for populists and they mistrust the established elite. But there seems to be something much deeper going on than that, something more structural, and migration is very much part of it. And I think where Peter got to is very much where I'd like to start, which is that the politics of migration are about far more than the number of people who are arriving in the country, or indeed the number of people who have arrived in the country over, say, the last century, and how integrated they are or not. There are legitimate questions and legitimate issues to debate about both of those subjects, about both migration and integration. But much of the political debate about migration is about completely different issues, often quite deep psychological, emotional issues, which nobody dares to talk about because of norms and established taboos. And so migration is a really convenient way of talking about them without mentioning them. So, for example, if you feel very uncomfortable, if you have nostalgia about the way your country is now, or about how the world is now, nostalgia for a past that perhaps never existed, but also anxiety about the future, that you don't know what it will bring, anxiety about globalization. Migration is the most tangible, most visible form of globalization in most people's daily lives. It's the sign of globalization that they see apart from the cheap jeans that they see in the supermarket. It's the migrants arriving. So they tend to blame the migration for all of the other anxiety about globalization. But it's also a way of, frankly, being racist without sounding racist. And that's happening in a lot of countries. You see that we've done some interesting discourse analysis on the debate in France, that the Front National has moved from being an openly racist party to being a much more covertly racist party. Because if you talk about migration, about, as Thomas was saying, the people who might come in the future, without seeming necessarily to criticize the people who are already here, it sounds as if you're not offending anybody. It sounds as if you're not against anybody in particular. But of course, you're your discourse is legitimating exactly those views. You're legitimating a resentment, a fear, a blaming of the people who are already here, and you can, and who are, you know, you have to look at what degree of integration they have without seeming to do that. But it's also a proxy for something else that's very important in Europe at the moment. And it's a proxy for beating the elites. It's another stick to beat elites with and blame them for. We did a very interesting study of the young supporters of populist parties through a survey on Facebook. This is a new and innovative methodology, which YouGov, which I'm sure will be using soon, to can buy very cheaply a little advertisement on Facebook targeting. We basically targeted the voters, those who just ticked like on their Facebook page, for various extremist parties, parties that are pretty xenophobic in one way or another. And I think they are quite varied. This is where a point of disagreement, there haven't been very many this morning, with Philippe. I think that there are very big differences between the Front National, UKIP, Golden Dawn, because populist parties have what Paul Taggart calls an empty heart. They tend to mould themselves to the national debate. In some countries it's okay, in Greece for example, to be quite openly fascist, whereas in other countries like the UK it is not, and so UKIP goes for Euroscepticism rather than anti-migration. But of course these parties are moving together. And what we found in this Facebook survey was that the motivations for supporting these parties, they did include issues like, I'm worried about what's national identity, I'm worried about the future of my country. Very little about, I'm worried about my job, interestingly. But one of the things that did come out very clearly was, I don't trust the politicians. I like this party because they speak openly and honestly about migration, which the other parties, they dare to say the things that other parties will not say. This was some of the discourse analysis. And in France, the results of the supporters of the Front National were very clearly basically just against, I think these are younger ones who perhaps don't even know the history of the party so much. They're against the established elites. That's what they really don't like. And there was a fantastic quote from one of them that I think really sums up how many of the people who support these parties feel. Basically it said, well, you screwed up your project, this Euro thing, so please don't come and screw up my life by handling migration policy. So it's this trust issue of, if you've messed up the economy so badly, then why should I trust you to deal with migration, which affects me directly in my daily life, so they feel. So that seems to be going on as well, that it's easy for Nigel Farage of UKIP, it's easy for Marine Le Pen, and it's easy also for Geert Wilders, of course, in the Netherlands, to say, well, the elites, they don't have to live with the migrants, they live off in their nice suburbs and in their gated communities and their nice houses. They don't live with the Roma, who of course are also lumped in with migrants, despite having been here for 9-10 centuries or so. They don't have to live with the migrants. They don't understand what it's like. They don't have the mosques being filled on Friday. Those kinds of arguments that the elite don't understand what it's like for us with migration, that's a really important part of the discourse right across Europe. And this is, you know, we've looked at now 17 countries, including Sweden. And I'll just mention one other little bit of the debate that I think is very relevant, that came out through a project we're doing with Counterpoint, a UK think tank that is also has a pan-European reach in its research, on something called the reluctant radicals. These are the people who wouldn't normally vote for populist parties and are not they may be anti-immigration, but they've never voted anti-immigration before. And they're of course a much bigger segment of the population. UKIP might get 10, 11, 12% if it's lucky in the UK, but you can have another perhaps 15, 20% in some countries who will only vote occasionally for populist parties, but at key moments that could really tip the balance electorally. And the reluctant radicals are interesting because they don't necessarily, the reason why they're voting for these parties right now is the feeling that representative politics is not delivering, that they can't influence the outcomes, that no matter who you vote for, you're going to get the same austerity policies. No matter who you vote for, globalization is going to continue. No matter who you vote for, migration policy will be more or less the same. As Philippe was saying, in some countries that means that, for example, in the UK, you actually get very restrictive migration policies, no matter who you vote for. In other countries, there's a sense that there's no real political choice being offered, and only the populists offer political choice. So my conclusions are two. There are many, many or more, but just two to highlight today. One is mainstream parties have got to get involved in this debate in a different way. It really matters how they react, because they are handing votes to the populist parties on a silver platter if they continue to react in the way that they have so far. They're not engaging with the discourse about the future, about globalization. There are many things that they need to address, which the migration debate is merely a proxy for. So that's one thing, and I'm really concerned in the European Parliament elections next year that that we could see a very large populist vote coming in. Not only might UKIP be the number one party coming from the UK, the Front National could be the number one party coming from France. It's still possible that Movimento 5 Stelle, if they don't completely fall apart in Italy, might be the number one in Italy too, and Golden Dawn could be number one in close competition with Syriza in Greece. So imagine a European Parliament full of demagogues and xenophobes with much greater powers under the Lisbon Treaty and with things like the Race Equality Directive to review next year. They could really start to make a difference at European level. That's very worrying. But the second thing where mainstream parties really need to watch out is that they can legitimate the claims of populist parties if they don't watch their step. Very interesting study by the Migration Observatory in Oxford. They did a poll recently where they asked people, politicians have made the following statement, do you agree with it? And they gave everybody the same statement, which had actually been made by a politician, but they attributed it to different parties, and then they saw whether people would agree with it or not. And the statement was, Muslim-only schools, which of course there are many now in the UK, Muslim-only schools are divisive and they push communities apart. Now, this was attributed to the BNP, the British National Party, which has very nationalistic, racist roots. People tended not to agree with it. It was quite a small proportion agreed with it. When it was attributed to UKIP, a larger proportion agreed with it. When it was attributed to the Conservative Party, the same statement, more than half of them agreed with it. So when mainstream parties basically either allow space for the discourse or they actually promote these views, it has a huge impact. So it's not that views about migration are fixed in stone and then people make political choices on that basis. Their views on migration are also affected by their political choices.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you also for reminding us about the electoral campaigns coming up. And for Sweden, it's a tandem challenge because we have our national elections coming up the same year. So I'll let Philippe come in, and also to all of you, like to have you commenting on how, are there concrete ways to make the gap between, the individual and the kind of political elite, as it's perceived at least? You mentioned what parties can do, but what's the role of organizations, or who are the key players? Can the EU do anything? But first, okay, Philippe, you were directly mentioned several times, so.
Yeah, I think, this is a crucial moment in Sweden's history. Heather said that Sweden is an outlier, and one has to hope that it remains so. You've got your elections next year. And there's been obviously a lot of reaction to the rise of the Sweden Democrats. The Sweden Democrats themselves are not the threat. The threat is how mainstream parties react to the Sweden Democrats. And basically there are three approaches. The first is to ignore the issue and to hope that it will go away. And that has been what most European parties have started, their initial reaction to the rise of populists. And it doesn't work. The issue doesn't go away. It just reinforces the sense that the mainstream or the elite parties don't want to listen to the concerns, and that only the populists speak the truth. The second reaction, and this is what has happened now in most European countries, is that mainstream parties try to pander to the voters of the populists. They try to echo the same policies. They argue that somehow, if they make the same arguments in a diluted form, that somehow they make them acceptable, and that they will take away support from the populists and the extremists. And that doesn't work either. It doesn't work because, as Heather says, it legitimizes the views of the populists and the extremists. And it leads people to say, well, these people are just saying it, they don't really mean it, we might as well vote for the real thing. And so actually it bolsters support for the UKIPs and the Sweden Democrats. So the third, and I believe the correct response, is that you need to understand why people are voting for these parties, and I agree with Heather, it's complicated. You need to address their concerns insofar as they're legitimate, but you need to be very robust in saying that the analysis of the situation that these parties make is incorrect, and that the solutions they propose are false. And be very robust in rejecting that, because that is the only way, in my view, that you can defeat the threat of the extremists and the populists.
Thank you. Thomas, I'll let you come in as well. And I know you've been very involved in the development in Hungary, among other things. And do you think, in general, established parties or well, the public have underestimated the forces, the xenophobic forces, and the populist attraction? If you look at Hungary, for example, it just keeps going.
Hungary is a very interesting case, actually.
Talking of outliers
where
as well.
we have a very strong right-wing party, Fidesz, and which has promoted a very nationalistic atmosphere in the country. And this has given extra energy to the Jobbik, to the extreme right group there, which is really extreme. It's anti-Semitic, anti-Roma, and anti-homosexuals, and very, very extreme, I would say, fascist type of political party. But they are quite strong. And when I was in Budapest last, the atmosphere among those I were in touch with was a bit of paralysis. The Jobbik demonstrated in the streets almost every day.
No one really knew what to do or how to calculate.
And how to argue. And of course, the response of Fidesz gave them a sort of coverage in reality. And I think what has already been said here, that the response of the midstream or sort of more established political parties in relation to the message from the extremists is absolutely crucial. And that's where we have failed. I think we have taken on those parties have taken the real, because there are problems with migration, of course. And there are problems in relation to integration as well, of course. And that has to be discussed in depth. And the established parties, also here in Sweden, tended to not want really to discuss these matters, or at least given the impression that they don't want to discuss it. And that has given food for this credibility gap between many people and those who really decide. So that has been a mistake. But also we have not argued for integration policy constructively. We have not given all the good arguments for migration policy and the benefits that our society and other societies would gain from that, and the humanitarian aspect. These are, in many cases, people in desperate need. Where is our heart in this? That type of argument, also the emotional arguments, have not really been voiced in an effective manner. Now I saw OECD try to, on the line of calculating the economic effects of immigration, and came to the conclusion that most countries in Europe actually benefit economically from immigration. That may be one type of argument, but it's not, I think, the key argument when it comes to this. So I think there's a failure both when it comes to demonstrating that the existing problems are really discussed in depth and with some competence, and at the same time make clear all the very positive and strong arguments for an open attitude to migration and constructive integration. So, yeah, it's a failure.
Thank you. And turn to you, Peter, because the UK is a very interesting and in many ways a confusing and grey, I won't say black, but grey example. Just, I mean, how is it possible that a country known to be very multiculturalist and with the history of the UK that has turned, so you have such a one-dimensional debate, and there are signs of the same in Sweden,
sure.
so
well,
we could learn something from
As I said earlier, we haven't expanded on the point, so the long-term issues to do with trust, globalization, social, people's sense of security, these are big things which take years, perhaps decades. But let me be more optimistic about the short term. This may be distinctive about Britain. Perhaps other people from other countries will say something about this. In terms of people who are already in Britain, I don't think racism is as big a problem as all that. It's certainly not as big a problem as it was when I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s. There are racists in Britain. But on the whole, there's a sense that people who are in Britain and have put down roots and have jobs, this is a good thing. You know, London today, many of you will know London. London is a glorious kaleidoscope of people from all over the world. And in general, people get on okay. Of course, there are problems in particular places and integration about people who huddle in particular communities who don't learn English and so on. But compared to the kind of race riots you saw in parts of London and other cities in the 50s, 60s, 70s, early 80s, those days are gone. So, so in as far as something can be done in the short to medium term, you know, I agree with everybody that we need to change the discourse. That people have got to say this is a good thing. But then what you can do within that is to say, just as, you know, if one wants to fight crime, one doesn't say every human being is a criminal. One can say immigration and racial diversity and multiculturalism are good things, but where there is abuse, we will tackle it. And the beauty of this is that people think there's abuses. What people think of as welfare tourism. People think that all people come to Britain because our welfare benefits, our welfare payments are generous. Very few people do. So if one then says, we will amend the rules to make it much harder for people to come to Britain for those reasons, one can, I think, demonstrate the process of improving public policy without actually doing much harm to the proper flow of people coming into Britain to work to make a better life for themselves, to add to the skills base of British life. So I think there are things that can be done, but what I do agree is that the mainstream parties have got to stop being defensive, stop nudging to the right, and be much more confident in asserting the benefits to immigration, and then say, in order to achieve the benefits, we must do these other things as well. I think there is an agenda that could be captured there.
Thank you. Now there are some minutes for questions. We'd love to hear, well, what do you think? Any comments? Please, we have a strict or a tight schedule, so keep yourself as short as possible. 140 signs might be a good... yes, let's start there. I think we take 3 questions in a row. And if you please say your name, and if you can, or if it's possible, direct your question to one of the panelists as well.
Sure. My name is Nick Grinstead. I'm an interested non-European. This is to the whole panel. Is there any sign of coordination across Europe from these radical groups? Is Golden Dawn, UKIP, Front National, are they getting together to coordinate policies either domestically or in the European Parliament? And in response to that, is there any coordination amongst the established parties? Is the Labour Party in Sweden, in Britain, coordinating their response against that?
Thank you. I had one over there as well. Maybe that's, well, we'll take them in together.
Thank you very much. My name is Jakob Dixon. My question was more about the rhetoric and the opinions, how to deal with, for at least the political parties and the policymakers, how to deal with the seemingly very divergent factual statements from extremist parties, from pro-immigration parties. There are a lot of factual quotations that are extremely different from each other and cannot reflect reality, all of them.
Thank you. And we have one up here in front, or even 2. Let's start there.
Thank you. My name is Kristina Lindahl from Sydow, and I have a question about the role of the press, because in the UK, as I understand it, the press is very much behind the quite harsh rhetoric against immigration. If you compare to Sweden, where the press is actually often criticizing the ones who want to discuss problems with integration, and I think that is behind the reluctance of some mainstream politicians and parties not wanting to discuss the problems, because you quite often stand as a racist if you try to raise the issues. So if I could have a comment on that, please.
We have one question on the coordination of both the radical parties, but also the mainstream ones. Who wants to? Heather? Yes, sure, please.
So, I mean, I haven't done undercover investigation of this, but I have heard rumours that there has been some coordination among populist parties. It's certainly true that within the European Parliament, those who've got representation have at times tried to form political groups in order to get more speaking time. Because under the Parliament rules, if you're not non-aligned, if you're part of a political group, you get more time. And of course, what they use the Parliament for is as a soapbox. So basically, they'll make a very racist speech. For example, one of the Jobbik MEPs will stand up and talk about Roma criminals, essentially needing to be taken out of Europe. And then they'll broadcast it on YouTube. because of course it looks as if they're being listened to in great respectful silence by a whole hemicycle of MEPs. So the soapbox is one way of doing it, but I think the concern that I really have now about what will happen next year with the Parliament elections is that these groups could get together in a much more coordinated fashion. So far they've only done it to get speaking time, and they've had very divergent views. Because it's a platform for them, they haven't really got that much involved in the Parliament's business. They haven't tried to chair committees, they've put in quite a lot of amendments and so on. But they could do that a great deal more if they saw it as their advantage. Many of them are actually Eurosceptics, so they're in a slight bind because they're inside the system. So they become part of a kind of self-hating parliament, which is a very awkward political institution indeed. So I think the coordination issue is an important one, and I'll leave it to others who are following the mainstream parties more closely. There is, I think, also coordination among centre-left, centre-right. But I think there's a more fundamental issue about the press and about the whole question of how to address these issues. And a very important part of this is to get better facts out into the debate, and the European level is very important here. I think a very good example recently, if I may praise a Swede in this gathering, is Cecilia Malmström's reaction to the letter of 4 of the interior ministers who asked for a debate about restricting free movement of people within the Union. This is not coming from outside the EU, but from within the EU, because they were concerned about welfare tourism. Now, and the Commission's response was, okay, and Cecilia Malmström says very clearly, give us the figures. How big a problem is this? How many people are claiming? How many of them are other immigrants from other EU countries? What exactly is the problem you're trying to solve, and why can't you solve it by national measures in your national social security systems? And that immediately put a dampener on the whole debate, because once you start asking for facts, it becomes a different kind of debate. But I think the thing about the press that's key is often the press is not putting out these facts
Now
either.
you're answering all the 3 questions. But I'll let sorry to interrupt you, but we're running short of time. So Philippe, maybe the question on facts, how to get more facts out in the debate, that touches directly on the topic of your book. Because that's what you do in the immigrant your country needs them. So if a brief comment to the question from the back, and then I'll let Peter Kellner comment shortly about the role of the press. And might be time for...
Okay, well, very briefly, yes. I mean, as Heather said, if you look at the facts, you look at the economic evidence, the fears about migration are not borne up by the facts. The fear that migrants depress wages or cost jobs, there's no economic evidence of that at all. The fear that migrants are coming to claim welfare benefits. Also, even the leading anti-immigration scholars haven't been able to find any evidence whatsoever of welfare tourism. And I know you were the one cheering the Sweden Democrats earlier on, and we look forward to your question, but actually that's not true. We don't contest the facts, because actually what you find is that people actually start from an emotional predisposition, which is, I don't like migrants, and then they blame them no matter what. So, when migrants are working, they're taking our jobs, and when they're out of work, they're claiming welfare benefits. When they're rich, they're driving prices up, and when they're poor, they're driving standards down. And what tells you is that migrants can't win. They're damned if they do and damned if they don't. This is not about facts, this is about an emotional dislike of others. And we look forward to your question.
Thank you. Peter.
I'll keep my very brief indeed. A lot, but by no means all of the British press plays into this populist agenda. Papers like The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Daily Telegraph. Other papers don't. And yes, politicians are scared of them. They're wrong to be scared. So it is having an effect, it is having a bad effect, and I just think our politicians have often become far too spineless. And I think these days it's perfectly possible for politicians to stand up and fight back against the populist press. Sadly, not enough of them do.
Thank you. So, one question there, and well, I think that's maybe what we have time for. Please keep your question very brief, or my environmental team will kill me.
Well, I'm Bertil Malmberg, and as Philippe addressed me directly, I would say I'm myself married since I'm 22 years ago with a migrant caravan. We have 2 teenage kids. So don't paste a racist card on me. And I've been living in Britain also in the middle of the previous decade for 4+ years. And there were always difficult integration problem. And every day I read my BBC, read my newspapers. There was always a problem with the Muslim community. Islam is involved everywhere where there are community problems in all of Europe. And Thomas Hammarberg talked about human rights. Muslim congregations have agreed to Cairo Declaration of Human Rights. Why do you never address that? So there are serious issues with the other parties. We never ever discuss serious. They just
Sorry,
play a card.
sir. Sorry, the question was about Islam in Europe, or?
Yes, there's the integration, but why do you never address that?
So, anyone wants to address that? Or?
There's a whole chapter in my book which addresses that, so I refer you to the book.
And it would be in Swedish.
And in fact, I also find that actually politicians do, at least in my country, do nothing else apart from discuss Islam, often with very little knowledge and often through sweeping generalisation. And the fact that you've lived in Britain, congratulations. It doesn't mean that your views are correct. And it doesn't mean that the views that you have might not be obnoxious or wrong.
When you say, in Northern Ireland, for decades, we have battles between Irish Republicans who are on the whole Catholic and Unionists who are on the whole Protestant. And just as it was wrong then to say this is the fault of Catholicism or it's the fault of Protestantism, you can't say now it's the fault of Islam. One of my colleagues who founded YouGov was Muslim. He's now a Conservative Member of Parliament, Iraqi by origin. To say that Nadim has anything in common with Islamic extremism. Islamic extremism exists, but it's just that Christian extremism exists, Jewish extremism exists. Let us not equate extremists with the generality.
Excellent end word. Thank you so much everyone for coming. Thank you for the panel. Sorry, so